So stiff peaks are what are going to give you the best, oh my God, sorry. In my stand mixer, that's the release button. God, I'm having a problem with these, sorry. Oh my God, disaster, okay. Hey everyone, I'm Claire Saffitz. On this episode of Try This at Home, I'm showing you a classic of French baking. It is the chocolate souffle. It is a relatively simple dish, but there's just lots of little technique here and there that will help ensure that you have really light, high-rising souffles. So I'm very excited to show you the recipe today. So souffles can be sweet or savory, and they are basically a mixture of like a flavored base and beaten egg whites. And so the egg whites lighten the mixture. And what happens as they bake is that there's tiny little air bubbles in these beaten egg whites. And as they bake, all the little bubbles expand and the souffle mixture rises and becomes like super light and airy. Souffles are inherently like an ephemeral creation because egg white foam is sort of unstable. So they will start to deflate and fall like basically right as you take them out of the oven. So there's something you want to serve right away. But really what I'm going to do is walk you through the whole process. I'm going to really go through the kind of the finer points of beating egg whites, how to know when they're at the right stage so that you can get a high rising souffle, whether you're making chocolate or any other kind. In my experience, it's better to make individual souffles rather than one large one. They just tend to rise more evenly. You have like better air circulation and more even heating throughout. So the recipe makes 4 souffles. And when I was developing the recipe, it's actually in my new book called What's for Dessert, I was thinking about like what is the optimal number of souffles to make. And I settled on 4 because I think for people at home, if they're not like a super experienced home baker, 4 is more manageable because it's something you want to serve right out of the oven. And you also want to get into the oven really quickly. I have some room temperature butter. So we want to butter the ramekins pretty well to prevent sticking. And to that point, I want to butter all the way around the rim. So make sure you're buttering to the very, very top. Now ramekins typically have this little ridge around the lip, and that's designed for making souffles. And you want to make sure that you're getting the butter all the way into that groove, all the way around. It has a tendency to anchor itself around the very edge if it's not well greased. And what happens in the oven as it starts to bake, it sets, and you get a souffle that domes rather than a souffle with a flat top and straight sides. So that's what we're going for, is that like dramatic, like miraculous restaurant, like everyone gasps kind of moment when you take it out of the oven. So once you have an even coating all the way around, take your pastry brush and you are going to do upward strokes starting at the very base of the ramekin all the way up to the lip. And it's these upward strokes that create like little striations in the butter, and that helps to encourage the batter of the souffles to rise upward as it bakes in the oven. We're also going to sugar them, so that layer of sugar also creates like a surface for that batter to cling to. So the combination of the sugared surface and those upward strokes helps to guarantee a high rising souffle. So it's important that you do this step first with the ramekins, because once you start to beat the egg whites and incorporate them into your base, there's no stopping point. And so like as soon as that egg white comes into contact with the base, which has that fat in it, it's going to want to deflate. So you don't want to have to then like, oh no, I forgot to do my ramekins and put that aside and then go ahead and butter them. So this is just a good thing to get out of the way. I'm gonna add my sugar. I'm just gonna sprinkle like a tablespoon or so into one of the ramekins, shake it around, and then tilt it and rotate, because you want just full coverage of the sugar, and then tap out the excess. So I'm just tapping out into the next ramekin. We're making a sweet souffle, so I'm using sugar, and it's like, you know, granulated sugar crystals are sharp, and so it does create a nice surface for the batter to grip onto. For savory souffles, you'll often see breadcrumbs or even like grated hard cheese like Parmesan or something like that. So the same principle applies, it's just not sugar. Okay? So those are the prepared ramekins. I'm gonna set them aside on a sheet tray. And I like to put them on like a large rim baking sheet. This is just a half sheet pan, because it benefits the souffles to have like lots of air circulation around them. So you don't wanna bake them like this. You wanna bake them spread out a little bit. So I'm gonna set these aside. All right, and now I'm gonna separate my eggs and move on to making our chocolate base. There's a slightly easier version of chocolate souffle, which I've made before, in which There's no flour. It's just melted chocolate, like that is the base. Then you whisk in your egg yolks and you fold in your egg whites, and that's it. And it's great. It has wonderful, like concentrated chocolate flavor, but it's really unstable. Like you pull those soufflés out of the oven, they collapse in 2 seconds. I found that adding just a couple of tablespoons of flour to the base really does help to create nice structure in the soufflés, and it doesn't compromise the flavor. It doesn't mute the chocolatiness or anything like that. So I'm using 3 yolks and 5 egg whites. So I'm going to separate my eggs. And it's easier to separate eggs when they're cold. These are like nearly room temp, but you want to beat the egg whites when they're room temp. So you can go ahead and separate them ahead of time and then let the egg whites come to room temperature on their own. The other ingredients that I have for souffle are like very straightforward. So we have eggs, more sugar, a little bit of milk, chopped up, dark chocolate. I wouldn't use like a super, super bittersweet chocolate for this because I think there's not a lot of sugar in the recipe. It's not overly sweet. So use something between like 60 and 70%. Cocoa powder, a little bit of flour, a little bit of coffee just to enhance and bump up the chocolate flavor, vanilla extract, and salt. So like really basic stuff. So I'm gonna start by cooking my base. So because we're only making 4, we're dealing in relatively small quantities here. I have a saucepan with a little bit of water in it, maybe like between a 1/2 inch and 1 inch. I'm using a double boiler because just in even a small saucepan, it's very easy to overcook this. A double boiler is sometimes called like a bain-marie, is an actual piece of equipment where you have like a pot that sits on top of another pot and there's boiling water underneath or simmering water. Most people don't have that, so we just use a heat-proof bowl that we set on top of a saucepan of simmering water, or even just below a simmer, not boiling, because that will get too hot. And I'm using a glass bowl so that you can see everything that's going on. But generally in a double boiler, metal is better because there's more effective heat transfer and it heats up and cools down more quickly. I'm gonna start with 2 of my yolks. The 3rd one I'm gonna whisk in at the end so it's not cooked. Then I have my sugar. I have 7 tablespoons of sugar. That's just under a 1/2 cup. I think, again, it's not like an overly sweet chocolate dessert. I'm gonna use some of it in my base, and then I'm gonna use 4 tablespoons for beating the egg whites. I tried making this recipe without the double boiler, but it's just such a small quantity of everything that it was just too easy to overcook. And then the benefit of doing it this way too is that you take it off the double boiler, you let it cool in the bowl, and then you beat the egg whites and you can mix everything right in the same bowl. And this is a step that's called blanching eggs. It comes from the French word blanchir, which means like to whiten or to bleach. And it just means that we're like lightening the mixture. You don't want to do this in advance really, because if you leave sugar and egg yolks in contact with one another for too long, it can create like little hardened bits that will never dissolve in the pastry cream or the base. So, okay, so this looks good. It's nice and thick and light. You can see it's gotten pretty pale. So next I'm gonna whisk in my milk. And you want to whisk and scrape the sides of the bowl. You know, you want everything well incorporated. You don't want any egg trapped anywhere. Then my coffee. Again, the coffee is just there to like bring out that chocolate flavor. It's really complimentary. So in goes the flour. When you're adding dry ingredients into wet, it's pretty easy to form lumps. So make sure you're stirring constantly with the whisk. With the addition of flour, which can sometimes mute some of that chocolate flavor, the cocoa I think helps to like really give it that flavored base. The cocoa gives it like a really deep chocolate flavor, and I think the chopped chocolate obviously makes it more chocolatey, but also gives it like a really kind of silky texture. So here I have this smooth mixture. My water it's at a high simmer, so I'm gonna turn it down a little bit. You can see it's steaming, that's what we want. Then this is gonna go, the bowl's gonna go right on top of the water. And I am going to sit here and whisk it constantly. And what's gonna happen is the temperature will increase, the starch and the flour will kind of activate and thicken the mixture. I also want to cook the egg yolks a little bit. So there's a little bit of a subtle change here in terms of the texture of this mixture. The consistency generally will kind of look like a thin pancake batter. Okay, so this is about done. It looks a little bit darker, and any foam that accumulated while I was whisking it in the beginning has really subsided. And it's kind of faintly holding the marks of the whisk. If you want to be really certain that you're hitting the right endpoint, you could stick like an instant read thermometer in there, and it should be around 170 to 180. Okay, so I'm gonna pull this off. Remember, especially if you have a metal bowl, that this is gonna be hot. Because I'm working in glass, it's actually not so bad. So now we're gonna incorporate our chocolate. Because chocolate is temperature sensitive, I don't really wanna like cook it over the heat, so I'm just gonna add that in, give it a quick whisk to incorporate, and all the heat from that base will slowly and gently melt the chocolate. So Go ahead and whisk this to smooth it out, and you can see all that chocolate is melting, and it's also thickening it quite a bit. It's dropping the temperature, so now it kind of looks like brownie batter. So I'm gonna add my vanilla extract. I think it's like a teaspoon. And now my final yolk. So the reason we don't add the yolk until this point is because I don't want to scramble it. You can see that yolk makes it like super glossy and beautiful. Adding like the yolk and the little bit of liquid from the vanilla extract helps to give it the right consistency. So I'm starting in a large clean bowl. Make sure there's no fat residue anywhere. So I have a note in the recipe that says like, don't use a plastic bowl. Even though it's clean, like you can scrub it out, even put it in the dishwasher, but it still tends to retain like a very, very thin residue of fat. And so it's just not great for whipping egg whites. So again, I have my 5 egg whites room temperature. Room temperature egg whites tend to whip up better than cold ones. So into the bowl. I'm using Diamond Crystal kosher salt. So I have a teaspoon. If you're using Morton, use about half that amount because it's saltier than Diamond Crystal. So salt is a great tool for whipping egg whites because it also contributes stability. So that's gonna go in. Doesn't make it salty, but it helps to really bring out the flavor of the chocolate. So then I have my remaining 4 tablespoons of sugar right here. Now the key to whipping up a stable egg foam, it is to gradually add your sugar. Oh my God, I started high and then that's low, that's speed 1. I've used a lot of different hand mixers, a lot of different ones. Okay, so the first thing we want to do when we're beating egg whites is to start them off on low and just to break them up. Have you ever noticed if you like crack an egg that the egg white, especially if it's fresh, will like hold together in a little like dome almost, like it has sort of structure to it. So we just want to break everything up. Then you can increase the speed to something more like medium. So I'm going to beat these now until they start to look opaque and foamy and white. They go from that like yellow translucent color of raw egg yolks to like snowy white. And you tend to get a more stable egg foam if you wait until you have this frothy white opaque mixture and then begin to add the sugar. So you can see they're transforming a little bit. Okay, so now I'm gonna start to add my remaining sugar. And I really wanna let the sugar crystals cascade into the bowl in like a very thin layer. So I want to add the sugar really, really slowly. And I want to allow the egg whites to whip pretty slowly as well. So I'm not really going above like medium speed. So take your time here. So once you've added all of the sugar, you can go ahead and increase the mixer speed to like medium high. Okay, so we are going to beat this until we have stiff peaks. Right now we are at soft peaks, somewhere between soft and medium. So that means that when I lift up the beaters, or if it's a spatula or a spoon, whatever, the egg white is droopy and it like holds its shape and amount a little bit. It doesn't just like fall back onto the surface, so it's not liquid, but these little droopy mounds, that is soft peaks. And you don't want to overbeat. So that's a really important part of the recipe is overbeaten egg whites tend to get grainy and almost like curdy looking, and they're really hard to incorporate into anything. So when you approach stiff peaks, you'll notice that the mixture is like holding really sharp lines as the beaters move through it. So that's an indication. You can see that they're looking dense, they're looking glossy. All right, see when I lift up the beaters, see those little peaks at the ends of the beaters? See how they're pointed straight up? We have stiff peaks. So it's important that you beat to stiff peaks because you want like all of that air in the egg whites and you want this mixture to be firm. So I'm gonna start by adding about 1/3 of this mixture to the chocolate base. So you can see that this is a really thick mixture. So what happens when you're incorporating something really light like this into something kind of firm like this is that first addition of egg whites is kind of like the sacrificial addition because it's much easier to incorporate 2 things together when they're of similar texture. So the first addition really just goes to lightening the chocolate. So I'm gonna scrape in about 1/3. For that sort of like sacrificial addition, I'm just gonna whisk the egg whites into the base. Okay, just until it's smooth. Now I'm gonna add the remaining egg whites in 2 additions. Okay, so now I'm gonna use a folding motion. I'm not using the whisk, I'm using a spatula. Folding is a mixing technique that's very gentle, so it's often used to like preserve the volume of a mixture like whipped cream or beaten egg whites. You take the spatula, it's good to use a flexible spatula like this, and you scrape down along the side across the bottom of the bowl, and then flip it over to the top. So I have just a couple streaks remaining. I'm gonna add my remaining egg whites. So I'm gonna fold this in now. So you do not want to overmix. Overmixing will cause the egg whites to deflate. Not the end of the world, you just won't have soufflés that are as light, but they'll still taste amazing. But the less mixing, the taller your soufflés will be. So once you have just like a streak or two remaining, you're good. Now I'm gonna fill my ramekins. So now to fill the soufflés, it's easier to work over the bowl, it's a little less messy. This part can get kind of messy. So the trick to a really high, tall soufflé is to completely fill the ramekin. So that's what I'm gonna do here. And when I say that, I mean like all the way to the very, very top. Again, another reason why we buttered the rim completely. So try to avoid big streaks of batter on the outsides of the ramekins, but it's not a big deal and you can just wipe it off at the end. Now, depending on how much you beat the egg whites, you might have not quite enough batter, or you might have like a little extra. So if you underbeat them, you won't have as much volume, and you might not even be able to totally fill all the ramekins. That's okay. Now I'm going to do a really important step, which is leveling the soufflés. I have a little offset spatula, and I'm going to scrape off, using kind of a quick motion, and smooth the surface of the soufflés so that I have this really level top. So now I have totally level soufflés. Now the next step is to sprinkle the tops with sugar. So I have just a little extra granulated sugar here, and I want to do kind of just an even layer. You don't have to be like terribly generous. But I found that a little sugar on top not only creates a nice kind of crunchy texture, but it also, I think, encourages, you know, like it to not dome, to stay really flat. There's another important step right before we bake, which is running your finger around the inner like lip of the ramekin, and you saw that little indentation at the top. So you're gonna use that as your guide. And I'm basically gonna wipe away a little ring of batter from the outsides of the ramekin. So removing that bit of batter from the very top of the ramekin prevents sticking, and it is again gonna help ensure that they rise really, really tall. And I'm not like wiping really aggressively. I don't really wanna take off like the butter that I put on there. I just wanna create a little bit of space between the batter and the ramekin. So I'm gonna give these a little wipe, but then I wanna work quickly. I wanna try to get these into the oven as soon as possible. They're so messy, sorry. All right, so the oven is on 425. As soon as I put them in, I want to drop the temperature down to 375. So soufflés benefit from like a little bit of a blast of heat right as they go into the oven, because that will kickstart the rise. So that is gonna quickly help to like heat the soufflés through, and those little air bubbles will expand and it will start its rise. But then we take it down to 375 because we want the soufflés to also bake evenly. These need like enough time to bake through so that I don't have like an overcooked edge and a raw center. So that's why we go down to 375, and it has that kind of steady, more moderate heat to bake all the way through. Another reason why it's better, I think, to bake individual soufflés than one enormous one, because you have more even baking. I don't want to look right at it as it bakes. It makes me, I mean, I know they're gonna be fine, but it just still makes me nervous. So 15 to 20 minutes is the time range. These have been going probably like 18, 19, I think, something like that. And I think they're about done. People should be sitting down, spoons in hand, when the soufflés come out, because you are gonna serve them immediately. So I'm gonna pull them out. So see how there's a little bit of a wobble to them? That's another doneness indicator. You want a little bit of a wobble. You don't want them to be like so done that they're stiff and straight. I mean, these look amazing. These are some of the taller soufflés that I've made. They almost like more than doubled in height, which is impressive. Overall, like the rise is amazing. The tops are really flat. They look so good. You know what's so crazy is like picking up the ramekin, it like almost weighs nothing. All right, this doneness looks great. Oh, this looks really good. And you can see like all the tiny little air bubbles in there. Top's like a little bit crunchy from the sugar, and then it almost like dissolves. The central technique of soufflé making is about whipping egg whites. Really, it's a technique that is so widely used in the whole realm of pastry and baking, so it's super useful. And once you get really good at it, one of the best applications is making soufflés, these sort of miraculous, like ephemeral, incredibly delicious, special dishes. There's some things I love making but I don't love eating, but souffle, it's like, it's both.